When I first met Kayla, it felt like fate had taken a break from its usual indifference and decided to play matchmaker. I was 26, grinding away as a mechanic in a small-town garage, fixing up pickup trucks and the occasional fancy import. Kayla was 24, a firecracker of a woman with red hair that seemed to ignite under sunlight, and a laugh so contagious it could make a funeral feel like a wedding. She came into the shop one sweltering July afternoon, needing her brakes fixed. But it wasn't the brakes she was interested in. It was me. "So, you're the guy everyone keeps telling me about," she said, leaning against the counter like she owned the place. "Depends on what they're saying," I shot back, trying to sound smoother than I actually felt. Truth was, I was already hooked. She had this confidence, this wild, carefree attitude that seemed so different from the slow, predictable pace of my life. A month later, we were officially dating. A year after that, we were married. For a while, it was good, really good. Kayla had a way of making life feel like an adventure, even when we were just hanging out in our tiny rented house, eating cheap takeout, and binge-watching bad TV. When our daughter, Madison Maddie, was born, I thought we'd finally hit the jackpot. She was beautiful, healthy, and full of life, just like her mom. But things have a way of changing, don't they? Slowly at first, like cracks in a windshield that seem harmless until the whole thing shatters. It started after Maddie turned 3. Kayla, who had always been the life of the party, started going out more and more. At first, it was just dinner with the girls or a quick drink after work. But those quick drinks turned into late nights, and those late nights turned into entire weekends where she wouldn't come home. I'd ask her where she'd been, who she was with, and she'd brush me off with excuses that felt as thin as tissue paper. "You're too controlling, John," she snapped once, slamming the fridge door. "I'm not some damn prisoner." I didn't know how to respond to that. All I wanted was for her to be present. For me, for Maddie, for the family we had promised to build together. But Kayla didn't see it that way. To her, I was the one holding her back, suffocating her. The arguments became a regular thing. Sometimes they'd start over something stupid, like the way I folded laundry or forgot to take the trash out. Other times, they'd blow up over bigger issues, money, trust, or never-ending nights out. The worst part was, no matter how hard I tried to keep my cool, Kayla always found a way to twist things around until I was the bad guy. Then one night, after one of our usual screaming matches, she dropped the bombshell. "I can't do this anymore, John," she said, standing in the middle of our kitchen with her arms crossed and her bags already packed. "I'm leaving." For a second, I thought she was bluffing. She'd said things like that before, in the heat of the moment, but she'd never followed through. "What do you mean you're leaving?" I asked, my voice cracking. "What about Maddie? What about us?" She didn't even flinch. "I'm not happy, okay? I need to figure out who I am without you breathing down my neck all the time." I wanted to fight back, to beg her to stay, but I could see it in her eyes. She was already gone. "Where are you going to go?" I asked quietly, hoping for some sliver of an answer that would make this make sense. "I'll figure it out," she said with a shrug. "I'll still see Maddie. I'm not abandoning her." And just like that, she walked out of the door and out of our lives, or so I thought. The first few weeks after Kayla left were a blur. I threw myself into work, partly because I needed the money, but mostly because I couldn't bear to be at home, surrounded by all the little reminders of her. Her favorite coffee mug still sitting in the cabinet. The half-empty bottle of perfume on the dresser. The wedding photo hanging in the hallway, mocking me every time I walked past it. Maddie took it hard, too. She was only 10 at the time, and she didn't understand why her mom wasn't around anymore. "Is Mommy mad at us?" she asked one night, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, sweetie," I lied, pulling her into a hug. "Mommy just needs some time to figure things out." But that wasn't enough for her. She wanted answers, real answers, and I didn't have any to give. At first, Kayla tried to stay involved in Maddie's life. She'd pick her up every other weekend, take her out for ice cream or to the mall, and drop her back off before bedtime. But even that didn't last. The visits became less frequent, and when she did show up, she was always distracted, more interested in her phone than her daughter. Still, Maddie adored her. She'd light up whenever Kayla walked through the door, and she'd spend the entire week counting down the days until she'd see her again. It killed me to watch her cling to someone who clearly didn't care as much as she should have. Then one day, Kayla dropped a bombshell of her own. She wanted to start taking Maddie to her place in the city. "I don't know about that," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "She's got school, and she needs a routine." "Oh, come on, John," Kayla shot back. "It's just a weekend here and there. Don't be such a control freak." I wanted to fight her on it, to tell her she wasn't fit to take care of Maddie, but I knew how that would go. Kayla always had a way of turning things around on me, making me look like the unreasonable one. So, against my better judgment, I agreed. At first, it seemed fine. Maddie would come back from her weekends with Kayla full of stories about all the fun things they'd done together. But over time, I started to notice a change in her. She became distant, moody, and quick to snap at me over the smallest things. "Why do you always have to ruin everything?" she yelled at me one night when I asked her to put her phone away at the dinner table. "Ruin what, Maddie?" I asked, genuinely confused. "We're just eating dinner." She rolled her eyes and shoved her chair back from the table. "Whatever. You're so boring. Mom's way more fun than you." That stung more than I'd like to admit. I'd been doing everything I could to hold our little family together, and now my own daughter was turning against me. But what really got to me was the way she started parroting things Kayla had said during our fights. "You're always so controlling," she told me one day when I asked her to clean her room. "Mom says that's why she left." It was like a slap in the face. Kayla was feeding her lies, turning her against me, and there was nothing I could do about it. By the time Maddie turned 13, things had gone from bad to worse. She was skipping school, staying out late, and talking back to me like it was her full-time job. I tried to set boundaries, but every time I did, she'd throw Kayla in my face. "Mom lets me do whatever I want," she said one night when I told her she couldn't go to a friend's party. "Maybe I should just go live with her." "You don't mean that?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But the truth was, I wasn't so sure anymore. Maybe she did mean it. Maybe she'd be happier with Kayla. But the thought of losing her, of being completely alone, was almost too much to bear. I didn't realize how far things had gone until the night I found the flyer. The flyer was for a nightclub in the city, one of those seedy places with a name like the Velvet Room. The kind of spot where drinks were overpriced, music was deafening, and the clientele was questionable at best. It was crumpled up in Maddie's backpack, half hidden under her schoolwork. I stared at it for a long moment, my stomach churning. What was my 13-year-old daughter doing with a flyer for a place like this? I wanted to believe it was some kind of mistake. Maybe one of her friends had given it to her as a joke. But deep down, I knew better. I waited until Maddie got home from school that afternoon. She walked through the door, earbuds in, and barely acknowledged me as she headed straight for the fridge. "Maddie," I called out, holding the flyer in my hand. "Can we talk for a second?" She glanced over at me, her face a mix of annoyance and indifference. "What? What's this?" I asked, holding up the flyer. Her eyes flicked to the paper, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of guilt cross her face. But just as quickly, it was gone. She shrugged. "I don't know. I've never seen that before." "Maddie," I said, my voice firm. "Don't lie to me." "I'm not lying," she shot back, her voice rising. "It's not mine. Maybe it got stuck in my bag or something. Why do you always have to assume the worst?" I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the way she wouldn't meet my eyes, the defensive edge in her voice, it was all too familiar. It was the same tone Kayla used to take when she was trying to cover her tracks. "I'm not trying to assume anything," I said, trying to keep my cool. "I just want to know the truth." Maddie rolled her eyes and grabbed her backpack off the floor. "Whatever, Dad. I don't have time for this." She stormed off to her room, slamming the door behind her. I stood there in the kitchen, holding the flyer, and feeling like the ground had just been pulled out from under me. Over the next few weeks, things only got worse. Maddie's attitude toward me became colder, more hostile. She barely spoke to me, and when she did, it was usually to argue or throw some snide comment my way. I could feel her slipping away from me, and I didn't know how to stop it. I tried to talk to Kayla about it, but that was a mistake. "What do you want me to do about it, John?" she said when I called her one evening. "You're the one raising her most of the time." "Yeah, and she's turning into someone I don't even recognize," I shot back. "She's moody, she's disrespectful, and now she's hiding things from me. I think she's getting into stuff she shouldn't be." Kayla laughed, and it wasn't the warm, infectious laugh I used to love. It was cold, dismissive. "She's a teenager. Of course she's moody. Maybe if you weren't such a control freak, she wouldn't feel the need to hide things." "Control freak?" I said, my voice rising. "You're the one taking her to God knows where on the weekends. Do you even know what kind of people you're exposing her to?" "Oh, give me a break," Kayla snapped. "She's fine. She's just growing up, John. Maybe you should try loosening the reins for once." I hung up the phone feeling more frustrated than ever. It was like talking to a brick wall. Kayla didn't see the problem, or maybe she didn't want to see it. Either way, I knew I couldn't count on her to help. One Friday night, I decided to confront Maddie again. She had just come back from spending the weekend with Kayla, and I could tell something was off. Her eyes were red and puffy, like she'd been crying, but when I asked her what was wrong, she just shrugged and said, "Nothing." "Maddie," I said gently, sitting down across from her at the kitchen table. "I know you're going through a lot right now, and I know things haven't been easy since your mom left, but I need you to talk to me. Please." She stared down at her hands, picking at her nails. For a moment, I thought she was going to open up, But then she shook her head and stood up. I'm fine, Dad. Just leave me alone. Before I could say anything else, she disappeared into her room. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty chair across from me and wondering what the hell I was doing wrong. The breaking point came about a month later. It was a Saturday night, and Maddie had gone to a friend's house, or at least that's what she told me. But when I called her friend's mom to check in, she said Maddie wasn't there and hadn't been all evening. My heart dropped. I called Maddie's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I called again, and again. Nothing. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed up, pacing the living room, staring at my phone, and waiting for it to ring. I thought about calling the police, but I didn't want to overreact. What if she was just being a typical teenager, sneaking out to a party or hanging out with friends? When she finally came home the next morning, she looked like she'd been through hell. Her hair was a mess, her clothes were wrinkled, and there was a distant, haunted look in her eyes. Where the hell have you been? I demanded, my voice shaking with anger and relief. Do you have any idea how worried I've been? Maddie just stood there, staring at the floor. I'm sorry, she muttered, her voice barely audible. Sorry doesn't cut it. I snapped. You lied to me. You didn't answer your phone. You. I said I'm sorry, she yelled, cutting me off. Tears were streaming down her face now, and her whole body was trembling. I didn't mean to. I didn't want to. Her voice broke, and she collapsed onto the couch, sobbing. I sat down next to her, my anger melting away as I realized how scared she was. Maddie, I said softly, putting a hand on her shoulder. What happened? Please talk to me. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. I saw something, she whispered. Something I didn't want to see. My stomach twisted into a knot. What did you see? She hesitated, like she wasn't sure she could say the words out loud. Mom, she finally said, her voice barely audible. I saw Mom with some guy. At a club. They were... Her voice trailed off, but I didn't need her to finish. I already knew what she was trying to say. For a moment, the room was silent except for Maddie's shaky breaths. I sat there, frozen, trying to wrap my head around what she'd just told me. Kayla, her mom, had brought her to a club. Not just that, she let Maddie see something no child should ever witness. My jaw clenched as anger surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm for Maddie's sake. Okay, I said slowly, putting a hand on her knee. Take your time. Tell me everything. Maddie sniffled and wiped her face with the sleeve of her hoodie. Mom took me to this place downtown. She said it was just for a little while, that she had to meet someone, and then we'd leave. But she started drinking, and then she just disappeared. I didn't know what to do, so I went looking for her. I nodded, encouraging her to continue, even though every word was like a punch to the gut. I found her in this back room, Maddie whispered, her voice trembling. She was with some guy. They were kissing. And other stuff. She covered her face with her hands, clearly mortified. I didn't even know what to do. I just ran out of there, my fists clenched so tightly my knuckles turned white. Kayla had always been reckless, but this was beyond anything I could have imagined. Maddie, I said gently, trying to keep the anger out of my voice. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I didn't want you to hate me, she said, her voice breaking. I thought you'd be mad at me for going with her. And Mom said if I told you, you'd use it to take me away from her. Her words hit me like a freight train. Kayla had been poisoning her mind, feeding her lies to keep her from telling the truth. My anger burned hotter, but it wasn't directed at Maddie. No, this was all on Kayla. I pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly as she sobbed into my chest. I could never hate you, sweetheart, I said firmly. This is not your fault. None of this is your fault. Over the next few days, I tried to figure out what to do. Confronting Kayla was the obvious choice, but I knew it wouldn't accomplish much. She'd deny everything, twist the story around, and somehow make it my fault. That was her specialty. But I couldn't just let this slide. She crossed a line, and it wasn't just about me anymore. This was about protecting Maddie. I decided to start documenting everything. Text messages, missed visits, and now, this new revelation. If it came down to it, I wanted to have as much evidence as possible to fight for full custody. The idea of taking Maddie away from her mom broke my heart. But what choice did I have? She deserved better than this. Meanwhile, things with Maddie were still rocky. She'd opened up to me about what happened, but that didn't erase the years of damage Kayla had done. She was still distant, still angry, and I didn't know how to bridge the gap between us. One night, as we sat on the couch watching a rerun of some old sitcom, I decided to take a chance. Hey, Maddie, I said, keeping my tone casual. Do you want to talk to someone? Like a counselor or something? She looked at me like I just suggested we move to Mars. I'm not crazy, Dad. I didn't say you were, I replied quickly. But you've been through a lot, and sometimes it helps to talk to someone who isn't, your boring old dad. She rolled her eyes, but there was a hint of a smile on her lips. You're not that boring. It wasn't exactly a yes, but it wasn't a no either. I decided to leave it at that for now. Pushing her too hard wouldn't help. A week later, I finally got the call I'd been dreading. Kayla, apparently sensing that something was up, decided to confront me. What the hell is your problem, John? She snapped as soon as I picked up. Maddie's been acting weird, and I know it's because you've been filling her head with crap about me. My grip tightened on the phone. You really want to talk about filling her head with crap, Kayla? How about we talk about what she saw at that club? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was defensive. I don't know what she told you, but she's exaggerating. She's a kid. She doesn't understand what she saw. She understands enough to know it wasn't okay. I shot back. You brought her to a club. You left her alone. And then you let her see. I stopped myself, my voice shaking with anger. Do you even realize what that's done to her? Don't you dare try to lecture me, John, Kayla snarled. You've always been so self-righteous, acting like you're the perfect parent. Newsflash, you're not. You're boring and overbearing, and that's why she hates you. Her words stung, but I didn't let it show. This isn't about me, Kayla. This is about Maddie. And if you can't see that, then maybe you don't deserve to be in her life. Oh, please, she scoffed. You wouldn't dare try to take her away from me. Watch me, I said, and then I hung up. That conversation was the last straw. I contacted a lawyer the next day to start the process of filing for full custody. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the only one that made sense. Maddie needed stability, and she wasn't going to get that with Kayla. When I told Maddie what I was planning, she didn't say much. She just nodded and mumbled, okay. I could tell she was conflicted. She still loved her mom, even after everything, but I hope she understood that I was doing this for her. As the weeks went by, things slowly started to improve. Maddie was still guarded, but she was starting to open up little by little. She even agreed to see a counselor, which felt like a huge win. But Kayla wasn't going down without a fight. She started calling more often, leaving angry voicemails accusing me of brainwashing Maddie and threatening to take me to court. Part of me wanted to block her number, but I knew that would only make things worse. One night, after another tense phone call with Kayla, Maddie came into the living room and sat down next to me. Dad, she said quietly, I'm sorry. For what? I asked, surprised. For everything, she said, her voice trembling. For yelling at you, for being such a brat, for believing all the stuff Mom said about you. I know now that it wasn't true. I pulled her into a hug, my throat tight with emotion. You don't have to apologize, sweetheart, I said. None of this is your fault. I'm glad I have you, she said, her voice muffled against my shoulder. I'm glad I have you too, I replied. In that moment, I felt a glimmer of hope. Things weren't perfect, and they might never be, but at least we had each other. The morning of the custody hearing was gray and heavy, like the sky itself knew what was coming. I sat in the waiting area outside the courtroom, trying to keep my nerves in check while Maddie sat next to me, scrolling aimlessly on her phone. She was quieter than usual, her face pale and drawn. I wanted to say something reassuring, but I wasn't sure what words could make this any easier for her, or for me. When Kayla walked in, dressed in a sharp navy pantsuit and looking every bit the confident, put-together mom, I felt my blood pressure spike. She gave me a quick, dismissive glance, then turned her attention to her lawyer, a slick-looking guy with a smug smile that made my skin crawl. Don't let her get to you. My own lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Carol, said under her breath. We got the evidence. Just stick to the facts. The facts. That's what this all came down to, didn't it? The nights Kayla didn't show up for her scheduled visits. The times Maddie came home upset, her head filled with lies. And, of course, the incident at the club. It was all there, neatly compiled in a folder that Carol carried with her like a shield. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to be a battle. When the judge finally called us in, I felt like I was walking into a war zone. The courtroom was sterile and cold, its beige walls and fluorescent lighting doing nothing to ease my nerves. Kayla and her lawyer sat on one side of the room, while Maddie and I sat on the other. She looked so small next to me, her usual fire dimmed by the weight of everything that was happening. The judge, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, started by asking both lawyers to present their cases. Carol went first, laying out the timeline of events with clinical precision. She talked about Kayla's inconsistent visits, her questionable lifestyle, and most importantly, the impact it had all had on Maddie. She even presented the flyer from the Velvet Room as evidence, along with a written statement from Maddie about what she'd witnessed that night. When it was Kayla's turn, her lawyer went on the offensive. He painted a picture of me as a controlling, overbearing father who couldn't handle the fact that Kayla wanted to live her own life. He claimed that I'd been manipulating Maddie, turning her against her mother to serve my own agenda. It was infuriating to sit there and listen to lie after lie, but I kept my mouth shut, knowing that losing my temper would only hurt my case. The hardest part came when Maddie was asked to speak. She looked terrified as she stood up, her hands trembling as she clutched the edges of her hoodie. I wanted to tell her she didn't have to do this, that she could just stay seated and let the adults handle it, but I knew that wasn't what she wanted. She needed to be heard. "Take your time," the judge said kindly, his tone softening as he looked at her. "There's no rush." Maddie nodded, taking a deep breath before she began. "I love my mom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But she's not the same person she used to be. She takes me to places I don't want to go, and she does things that make me feel uncomfortable." She paused, glancing over at Kayla, whose face was an unreadable mask. "She told me not to tell my dad about the club because she said he'd use it against her. But I couldn't keep it a secret anymore. It wasn't right." The judge nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Madison. That was very brave of you." As Maddie sat back down, I gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and relief. I wanted to tell her how proud I was, but the words got stuck in my throat. After hours of back-and-forth arguments, witness statements, and character assessments, the judge finally announced his decision. Based on the evidence presented, it's clear to me that the current custody arrangement is not in the best interest of the child. Effective immediately, full custody will be awarded to Mr. John Bradley. Mrs. Kayla Bradley will be granted supervised visitation, pending further review. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was quickly tempered by the sight of Maddie's face. She wasn't smiling. In fact, she looked like she was about to cry. Kayla, on the other hand, exploded. "This is bullshit," she shouted, slamming her hands on the table. "He's poisoning her against me. You can't just take my daughter away from me." "Mrs. Bradley, I suggest you calm down," the judge said sharply, "or I will hold you in contempt of court." Kayla glared at him, her jaw tight, but she didn't say another word. Instead, she stormed out of the courtroom, her lawyer trailing behind her like a loyal dog. The ride home was quiet. Maddie stared out the window, her face unreadable. I didn't know what to say to her. Part of me wanted to celebrate, to tell her that everything was going to be okay now, but I knew that wasn't how she felt. She'd just lost her mom, at least in the way she'd always known her. No matter how toxic Kayla had been, she was still her mother. When we got home, I made us some dinner. Spaghetti, her favorite, but she barely touched it. "I'm not hungry," she muttered, pushing her plate away. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked gently. She shook her head. "Not right now." I nodded, giving her the space she needed. "Okay, but if you change your mind, I'm here." She gave me a small, sad smile. "Thanks, Dad." The weeks that followed were tough. Maddie was withdrawn, spending most of her time in her room or at school. I tried to keep things as normal as possible, but the shadow of the custody battle lingered over both of us. Kayla, true to form, wasn't making things any easier. She called constantly, leaving angry voicemails accusing me of brainwashing Maddie and threatening to take me back to court. One night, after another particularly nasty message, Maddie came into the living room. "You don't have to listen to her, you know," she said, crossing her arms over her chest. "I know," I replied, turning off my phone. "But she's still your mom. I don't want to cut her out completely." Maddie hesitated, then sat down next to me. "I know she loves me," she said quietly, "but I don't think she knows how to show it anymore." I put my arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "That's not your fault, Maddie. None of this is your fault. I just wish things could go back to how they used to be," she said, her voice breaking. "Before everything got so messed up." "I know," I said softly. "Me too." For the first time in a long time, she let herself cry. And as I held her, I realized that no matter how much pain we'd been through, we still had each other. And for now, that was enough. The weeks turned into months, and slowly, life started to feel more stable. Maddie and I fell into a rhythm, one that wasn't perfect but felt manageable. I cooked dinner most nights, and we made a habit of sitting at the table together, even if she only picked at her food some days. We found small ways to connect, a movie night here, a trip to the local diner there. It wasn't the life I'd envisioned for us, but it was better than the chaos we'd been living in. Maddie still struggled with the fallout from everything that had happened. She had moments where she seemed like her old self, laughing at one of my dumb jokes or rolling her eyes when I tried to dance in the kitchen. But there were other times when she'd retreat into herself, her eyes distant and her answers clipped. I didn't push her on those days. I knew she was still processing everything, and I wanted her to feel safe to do it at her own pace. Kayla's supervised visits were another hurdle. The court had ordered that she could see Maddie for 2 hours every other Sunday at a local community center, with a social worker present to oversee the interaction. At first, Maddie was hesitant to go. "What's the point?" she said one morning as we sat in the car outside the center. "She's just going to act like everything's fine. Maybe she'll surprise you," I said, though even as I said it, I didn't entirely believe it. Kayla wasn't exactly known for self-reflection or accountability, but I wanted Maddie to feel like she had the option to rebuild that relationship if she wanted to. When she came out 2 hours later, her face was a mix of frustration and sadness. "She didn't even ask how I was doing," she said, slamming the car door shut. "All she talked about was how unfair everything is and how you're trying to keep me away from her." I clenched the steering wheel, forcing myself to stay calm. "I'm sorry, kiddo. That's not okay. It's whatever," she muttered, crossing her arms and staring out the window. But I could tell it wasn't whatever. It hurt her, even if she didn't want to admit it. One Sunday, after yet another disappointing visit, Maddie finally broke. She stormed into the house, threw her backpack on the floor, and started pacing the living room. "Why does she even bother?" she yelled, tears streaming down her face. "If she doesn't care about me, why doesn't she just leave me alone?" I stood there, unsure of what to say. Part of me wanted to agree with her, to tell her she was right, that Kayla was selfish and careless and didn't deserve her. But I knew that wouldn't help. "She does care about you," I said carefully. "She just doesn't always know how to show it. Stop defending her." Maddie snapped, her voice sharp and angry. "You're always trying to make excuses for her, but she doesn't deserve it. She doesn't deserve anything." Her words hung in the air, heavy and bitter. I didn't argue. Instead, I walked over to her and pulled her into a hug. At first, she resisted, her body stiff and unyielding. But then she crumpled, sobbing into my chest. "I just want her to be my mom," she whispered. "Why can't she just be my mom?" "I don't know, sweetheart," I said, my own voice thick with emotion. "I wish I had an answer for you." As the months went by, Maddie started to pull away from Kayla completely. She stopped going to the supervised visits, and I didn't push her to keep going. The court order allowed her to choose, and she made it clear she didn't want to see her mom anymore. Kayla, of course, didn't take it well. She called me constantly, leaving angry voicemails and accusing me of turning Maddie against her. I stopped answering after a while. There was no point. One night, after another round of missed calls from Kayla, I found Maddie sitting on the couch with a notebook in her lap. "What are you working on?" I asked, sitting down next to her. She shrugged, not looking up. "Just writing stuff. Can I see?" She hesitated, then handed me the notebook. The pages were filled with messy handwriting. Poems, sketches, bits of song lyrics. It was raw and unpolished, but it was beautiful in its own way. One poem caught my eye. "I waited for you, but you never came. I called for you, but you never answered. Now I'm learning to stand on my own, even though my legs are shaking." "That's really good, Maddie," I said, handing the notebook back to her. "You've got a real talent." She gave me a small smile, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Thanks. You ever think about sharing these with someone? Maybe joining a writing club or something?" She shook her head. "They're just for me. But it helps, to get it out." "Yeah," I said, nodding. "I get it." And I did. Writing had always been my way of working through things, too, though I hadn't done much of it in years. Seeing Maddie find her own outlet made me feel a little better, like maybe we were both learning how to cope in our own ways. One evening, as we sat together on the couch watching a movie, Maddie turned to me and said, "Do you think I'll ever be okay?" The question caught me off guard. I paused the movie and turned to face her. "What do you mean? Like, after everything, Mom, the court stuff, all of it, do you think I'll ever stop feeling broken?" My heart ached for her. "You're not broken, Maddie," I said firmly. "You've been through a lot, yeah, but you're strong. Stronger than you know. And yeah, it's going to take time, but you'll be okay. I promise." She nodded, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "Thanks, Dad." The weeks turned into months, and slowly things started to get better. Maddie threw herself into her schoolwork and her writing, and I made an effort to be as present as possible, even when I was exhausted from work. We weren't perfect, but we were a team, and that was enough. Kayla, on the other hand, faded further into the background. After a few months of angry phone calls, she stopped trying to contact us altogether. I heard through the grapevine that she'd moved to another city, but I didn't tell Maddie. She didn't need to know. One day, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Maddie turned to me and said, "You know what, Dad? I think I'm going to be okay." I smiled, my chest swelling with pride. "Yeah, kiddo, I think we both are." The first anniversary of the custody ruling came and went without much fanfare. Life had settled into a new, kind of normal, one that was quieter, more predictable. Maddie was 14 now, a freshman in high school, and while the scars of the past were still there, they weren't as raw as they once were. She'd grown in ways that amazed me. More independent, more self-aware, and, dare I say, wiser than her years. She still had tough days, but they were fewer and farther between. Kayla, on the other hand, was all but a ghost in our lives. After her initial outrage over the custody loss, she disappeared entirely. No calls, no letters, not even a birthday card from Maddie. Part of me was relieved. The absence of her chaos made it easier for Maddie to heal. But another part of me was angry, not for myself, but for Maddie. I hated that she had to face the reality of a parent who had given up on her. No kid should have to carry that weight. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table, Maddie brought her fork down with a clang and said, "I want to see her." I froze, the piece of chicken on my plate halfway to my mouth. "What?" I asked, setting my fork down. "Mom," she said, her voice steady, but her eyes uncertain. "I want to see her. Just to talk." It felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. Part of me wanted to say no, to protect her from whatever fresh hurt Kayla might bring. But I knew I couldn't make that decision for her. "Are you sure?" I asked carefully. "She hasn't reached out in over a year, Maddie. You don't owe her anything." "I know," she said, fiddling with the edge of her napkin. "But I need to know why, why she didn't fight harder, why she didn't try." I nodded slowly, my chest tight. "Okay," I said. "If that's what you want, I'll support you. But I'm coming with you." "Deal," she said, offering me a small, grateful smile. Finding Kayla wasn't hard. A quick internet search turned up her new address, along with a social media profile that painted a picture of a woman who hadn't changed much. Her posts were full of party pictures and selfies with captions about living her best life. Not a single mention of Maddie. When I called her to arrange a meeting, she sounded surprised. "Maddie wants to see me?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "She does," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "But I'll be there too. We're not doing this on your terms." Kayla sighed. "Fine. When?" We agreed on a time and place, a neutral spot, a coffee shop halfway between her city and ours. I hung up the phone feeling a mix of dread and hope. Maybe this would be the closure Maddie needed. Or maybe it would just open old wounds. The day of the meeting, Maddie was quiet as we drove to the coffee shop. She stared out the window, her face unreadable. I wanted to ask her how she was feeling, but I didn't want to push her. Instead, I reached over and gave her hand a squeeze. She squeezed back, and that was enough. When we arrived, Kayla was already there, sitting at a corner table with a latte in front of her. She looked almost the same as she always had, same fiery red hair, same confident posture, but there was a hardness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Maddie," she exclaimed, standing up as we approached. "You look so grown up." Maddie hesitated, then sat down across from her. I took the seat next to her, keeping my expression neutral. "Hi, Mom," Maddie said softly. For a moment, no one said anything. Kayla seemed unsure of how to start, which was a first for her. Finally, she said, "I'm really glad you wanted to see me." Maddie nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I have questions," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And I need you to be honest." "Of course," Kayla said, leaning forward. "Ask me anything." Maddie took a deep breath. "Why didn't you fight for me? After the court ruling? Why didn't you even try?" Kayla blinked, her confident facade faltering. I didn't think you wanted me to," she said. "Your dad made it clear that." "Don't," Maddie interrupted, her voice firm. "Don't blame Dad. This is about you. Why didn't you fight?" Kayla looked down at her latte, her hands wrapped tightly around the cup. "Because I didn't think I could win," she admitted finally. "The judge made up his mind, and I thought, maybe it was better this way. For you?" "That's bullshit," Maddie said, her voice cracking. "You didn't even try. You gave up on me?" "I didn't give up," Kayla said, her voice defensive. "I thought I was doing what was best for you." Maddie shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You don't get to decide what's best for me. You're my mom. You were supposed to fight for me, no matter what. But you didn't. You left." Kayla opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time, she looked truly defeated. The rest of the meeting was tense and awkward. Maddie asked a few more questions, but it was clear she wasn't getting the answer she needed. When it was over, she stood up abruptly and said, "I think we're done here." Kayla looked like she wanted to argue, but she didn't. She just nodded and said, "I'm sorry, Maddie, for everything." Maddie didn't respond. She turned and walked out of the coffee shop, and I followed close behind. On the drive home, Maddie was silent. I glanced over at her, worried about how she was processing everything. "You okay?" I asked finally. She nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think I am." "Really?" I asked, surprised. She looked over at me, her eyes clearer than they'd been in a long time. It's like now I know. She's never going to be the mom I wanted her to be. And that sucks. But at least I can stop wondering. I nodded, my chest tight with emotion. "I'm proud of you, Maddie. That took a lot of courage." She smiled faintly. "Thanks, Dad." Life didn't magically become perfect after that, but it felt lighter somehow. Maddie started focusing more on her writing, even entering a few contests at school. She laughed more, smiled more, and the walls she'd built around herself began to come down. As for Kayla, we didn't hear from her again. Part of me hoped she'd find a way to turn her life around, but I wasn't holding my breath. All I could do was focus on the one thing that truly mattered, being the dad Maddie needed me to be. Because at the end of the day, it wasn't about what we'd lost. It was about what we still had. And that was enough.